So just before Christmas, because apparently she just likes to give us Christmas presents,
I've got presents. Yeah.
J.K. Rowling tweeted something that could be construed as transphobic. Oh, thank you? So a lot of us confirmed what we had already suspected, that J.K. Rowling holds transphobic views, or at the very least, has shown overt support for a woman who has very clearly have directly targeted and harmed transgender people. And if you don't agree with that, maybe this video isn't for you, unfortunately. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out some of my other videos that more thoroughly explain the situation. But for a lot of us, this revelation about J.K. Rowling's views towards an extremely marginalized community in today's society, which, by the way, I am a part of, came as a shock and deeply hurt. It even came as a shock to those of us who had already suspected that those were her views. You see, J.K. Rowling's most famous work, the Harry Potter book franchise, has been one of the formative texts of my entire generation, and for many other generations as well. And so many of us throughout the world hold up her works, which speak out against the dangers of fascism, how dehumanization of the other works.
Are those
Muggles in their rightful place.
The emotional development of kids to young adults, as well as just being a fun fantasy adventure, as incredibly influential in our development of ourselves and our values, and just the things that we like in our fiction. For me, as someone who doesn't really hold any specific religious beliefs, I often use stories and fandoms as my particular guidance for moral values, with Star Trek being perhaps the biggest, but Harry Potter being the second biggest. Not to mention that Harry Potter itself has a huge queer and transgender fanbase. On top of that, J.K. Rowling herself has always been seen as someone to look up to. I mean, she was one of the few, if not only, billionaire to lose that status through charity work. So what are we to make of this author who created something so informative to so many of us and has done good, turns out to have disgusting and harmful views? Or again, at the very least, is supportive of views and people who actively harm an already harmed community? Well, a lot of people this week, when they learned about J.K. Rowling, turned to a literary theory called death of the author. But does death of the author actually work when the author has expressed so directly harmful views? And how does that not color our interpretation of a text? Up until the 1960s, an author's life or direct interpretation of a work were used to discuss text. For example, J.R.R. Tolkien lived through World War II as a soldier, so many people read themes of World War II into his Lord of the Rings books, such as the ring being a metaphor for the atomic bomb. But one could also look at the author's intended interpretation. Again, J.R.R. Tolkien would argue that his work was not meant to be directly allegorical and wasn't about World War II, but instead discussed Christian themes. Now already in that we can see a tension already between these two views of literary criticism, biography and direct intent. You'd think they line up more directly, but as is the case with Tolkien, that isn't always true. You could read Tolkien as an allegory using his biography as a person in World War II as a guide, or you could read it through the lens of how the author intended it, through a more Christian lens. And I'm not saying that World War II allegory or Christian lenses are the only thing that you can get out of The Lord of the Rings, but they are sort of big interpretations of the work using author intent and biography. So how do you interpret all of that? Enter Death of the Author, which was argued by French critic Roland Barthes in 1967, which argued that we shouldn't use an author's intent or biography to distill meaning from an author's work, but instead from simply the text itself. He argued that an author's intent or biography limited a text. A text can speak to many things and to many people, even in ways that weren't directly intended. It matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be. That's a line from Harry Potter, spoken by Albus Dumbledore. It's a line about the purity of bloodlines, discussing within the text about how wizards place too much emphasis on if someone is a pureblood wizard or a not pureblood wizard, to determine if they're worthwhile in the magical world. Those who have Muggle ancestry, non-magical ancestry, were seen as less than, dehumanized, and eventually attempted to be genocided by the villain Voldemort and his followers. Clearly that line is meant as a direct discussion of the dangers of dehumanization, which was clearly partially the intent of J.K. Rowling. But that line can also be taken outside of that intent. Look at it again and we can see how many transgender people can easily take that line and read a trans reading onto it. We are not who we are born, limited by the gender we are assigned at birth, but what we grow to be. the gender we actually find ourselves. But that trans reading of that line was certainly not intentional by the author J.K. Rowling. That's something that we can pull out of it just by looking at the text and sort of seeing what we get out of it ourselves, not looking at J.K. Rowling's intent or her biography. But even though I can read that interpretation into it, it's still extremely hard to separate that this was written by a woman who doesn't support me, or probably would not support my direct interpretation of that line. I'm thinking in the back of my head, this is clearly not what she would have interpreted it as. It's almost impossible for me, as someone who is harmed by something that she has said, to completely remove that context from the work. In fact, we could look at the exact line and read the exact opposite into it. I am what I am and I'm not ashamed. That's a line said by Hagrid in the books, talking about himself as a half-giant. A trans man could look at that line and interpret that as being a supportive line of them being transgender, saying, I am transgender and I am a man and I'm not ashamed of that. However, other people can read different things into it. A TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist, which is the type of person that Rowling has shown support for, could also look at that line though and say,
well, a trans man is born a woman who is ashamed of being a woman. And that they shouldn't be ashamed, they should just accept that they are a woman.
By doing so, by reading that interpretation into that line, they're invalidating a trans man's identity as a man, which, as I've discussed in other videos, is extremely harmful to trans people. Not to say just flat out wrong. But which of these interpretations do you think J.K. Rowling, who has shown active support for a TERF, would support? Now, I can't say for sure, but I know the discourse around J.K. Rowling now, and I think I know which one I at least feels she supports. And no matter how much I try to divorce that reading of the text, I can't help but think about that while reading Harry Potter now. And you could do this to many things. You could read how Harry and Ron belittling Hermione and her campaign to help house elves in the Goblet of Fire as a representation of how many of YouTube today decries social justice warriors or SJWs. And that's certainly an interpretation I personally find to have gross implications. I agree with Hermione during those segments, we should be freeing the house elves. But the fact that she gets belittled for that can be taken to some dark interpretations. But it's definitely there in the text.
Hermione, said Ron, cottoning on. You're trying to rope us into that spew stuff again. No, I'm not, she said hastily. And it's not spew, Ron. Changed the name, have you? Said Ron, frowning at her. What are we now, then? The House Elf Liberation Front?
But we could also use it as an interpretation of how maybe Hermione needs to learn how better to sell her campaign, to sell her ideas. That even the best of intentions needs someone who knows how to organize, who knows how to get across their message. But I still kind of find that that whole segment has weird implications. Yet I can also look and directly see how J.K. Rowling has even understood her own text. For example, Hermione is called a mudblood, a slur meant to devalue her as a muggle-born witch. Yet the word technically does apply to her. She is technically a muggle-born witch, but does that make her less than? Does that make her less of a wonderful witch despite others attempting to belittle and dehumanize her for something she cannot change? No. Hermione is perhaps one of the best witches of her age. And the same thing could be interpreted for trans people. As a trans woman, I would be the first to admit that I am biologically male, with XY chromosomes. At least I assume I do without having had any direct genetic testing. Yet, does this make me any less of a woman? Trans people like myself would say no. And that's a clear parallel that I can see to Hermione. That's 100% very easy, valid interpretation of Rowling's work. One that I find it hard not to read that into it. And I may be wrong, but I think it's one that I think Rowling herself would find hard to argue around, despite being the author of that work. Certainly it can be done, and I'm sure some of you down there in the comments are going to tell me how, but I tend to think that even that would be more of a stretch of an interpretation than I have laid out. So J.K. Rowling hasn't always agreed with some of the ideas in her own work. So there are moments where J.K. Rowling, the person, pushes me out of the work and makes me read certain things into it that I don't really like, and there are certain times where my reading of J.K. Rowling as a person sometimes directly conflicts with the ideas that she herself has expressed in the books. So how do I deal with these conflicting viewpoints? My conflicting viewpoints of my own interpretation, J.K. Rowling's interpretation, and J.K. Rowling a person. Not only all of this, but J.K. Rowling, even beyond that, has shown that she is willing to add new text and interpretations to her ideas of the work, even afterwards on Twitter and in her Fantastic Beasts movie. Take, for example, that Dumbledore is gay, something that fans now all take as fact, despite it not being something that is directly in the books, but is just interpretable. But she's adding these as direct new facts about the books, not interpretations, but facts. She's saying Dumbledore is in fact gay, period. But it's not there in the book. So how do we take that? How do we take these new facts, something that's not so easily malleable in terms of interpretation? How can I not read Harry Potter and think about Dumbledore being gay now? So if J.K. Rowling tomorrow tweeted or wrote on Pottermore that, I don't know, Hermione turned out to be the world's biggest TERF after Hogwarts, shouldn't we add that into our interpretation? Shouldn't that be something that we could find within the text, find reasons for, or do we just ignore that fact? These are all questions that I don't have an answer to. As I grow older, there are many issues that I have found with the Harry Potter books, even without J.K. Rowling's interpretations or involvement. Take, for example, the fact that all house elves seem to actively enjoy being enslaved, and how their enslavement has been directly tied to slavery of African Americans in America. That rings really problematic to me. Sure, there's discussion of how the Wizarding World's treatment of house elves as inferiors speaks much more to a wizard's character than the house elves, but it also erases things like how often slaves have fought back against their oppressors, and ends up belittling, at least in my interpretation as a white person, people of color through the house elves. And that's just something that's in the books, not something that J.K. ruined after the fact. So how do we look at Death of the Author with all of these questions rolling around? How do we say this interpretation goes against what I think the author would say can be my interpretation? Or how a direct reading a book may go completely against what an author says? Or take an interpretation of something that can be read in completely different ways from each other that are directly opposed to each other? And how do I take away things that are problematic within the book itself? These are all questions that surround this work, and none of them I can completely remove. In today's day and age, where we are so quickly able to know an author's thoughts and feelings, it's almost impossible to separate an author from a work completely. Yet I also cannot remove myself from a work either. Harry Potter changed and informed me. It helped create traditions and rituals and friendships and memories in my life that I don't wish to change, and it's something that I couldn't change even if I tried. So for me, I think Death of the Author is a useful tool to practice. It's something that I can say, all right, I'm going to ignore some of the things that J.K. Rowling has said, some of the interpretations, and I'm just going to look at what I can find in this book that means something to me, and you cannot take that away from me. But it's also something that I think we should solely and completely subscribe to. There is use in looking at things from multiple interpretations and multiple angles. That's why on this channel I look at Star Trek through multiple lenses, alternatively praising and criticizing it, even some exact same moments from episodes, because I'm looking at those moments through different lenses. In the end, I think we must remember that our relationship with a work is a conversation, a multi-voiced one. One voice is the author, another voice is the text itself, and another voice is our own. And another one could be the fandom or community we find around these works. And as with any conversation, we can listen and hear what other voices have to say at different times, and also use them to re-examine our own voice and thoughts. While J.K. Rowling's voice may be harmful and hurtful to me and others, there's an element of listening to it that adds to helpful discussion of the text. For example, I wouldn't have made this video for you if J.K. Rowling hadn't said what she said. Now, that's not to say that J.K. Rowling having transphobic views is a good thing, but it doesn't have to be wholly bad either. We can take it as a moment to learn more about a text, to dissect our feelings about a text, and take it and make something positive out of a really horrible situation. At the end of the day, we have to take away for ourselves what is important to us. And for me, what will always be important is the desire that Harry Potter gave me to fight back for all those who would be harmed or dehumanized, and desire to always try to make the world a better place for everyone. That's something that no one can take away from me, not even J.K. Rowling, the woman who helped give me that in the first place. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you look at the Harry Potter text now after J.K. Rowling's views have come out. Does it change the way you view the text? Does it add something new to the discussion? Or does it completely ruin the text for you overall? And if you would like to see more videos like this, please give my channel a subscribe. It really helps me out. And also, if you want to help make this channel even better, give to my Patreon page. It really means a lot to me. Every little bit on my Patreon helps me pay the bills, helps me make these videos even better. I've also got some financial stuff coming up this year, and I hope that all of you, as always, live long and prosper. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, Stefan Schuhart, Michael McGee, Boyd Earl, Law Lindley, Wellington Marcus, Munir Amlani, BBD, and Mari Nekar.